Hello, everyone. We've got a decent crowd here. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll probably talk slow for the first couple minutes because there's a few more people joining us. We are recording this event. Just as a heads up, it'll record whatever I see on my screen. So most likely, if you're a guest joining us, your picture or your video feed will not be included. All right. Hello. Oh, there's still a couple people. Hello and welcome to Unpacking the Exhibition, Art and Power. This is the first in a series of events that we're offering in support of our fall exhibition titled Honest and Unrefined, Art Outside the Academy, which is now on view at the Haas Center for Performing Arts on our Allendale campus. If you haven't seen the show yet, I'm in the space. You're getting a little peek at it right now, but we also have an interactive 3D tour available on our webpage, along with a reading list that was provided with support from our university libraries and some other additional learning resources. I'll drop a link in the chat to that webpage. The exhibition itself will be up through November 5th. You're welcome to come see it anytime. Our hours are listed on our webpage, and we also have next Thursday, September 30th from 5 to 8 p.m. a reception for the event, and I'll also drop a link for you to RSVP to that. All right, so if you're a student who's joining us to receive credit for an INT 100 or 201 course, please drop your email address into a private chat to Art Gallery Amanda Rainey, that's me, just as a way to take attendance. Today, we're thrilled to welcome our panelists for a conversation about art and power. And before I introduce them, I'd like to share some background to provide some context for you all about outsider art in general. Outsider art has become a catch-all phrase for everything that appears to be raw, irrational, and unschooled in the art world. Historically, it's tied to the term art brut or raw art, coined by the French critic and artist Jean Dubuffet in the mid-20th century. Dubuffet became interested in art primarily created by patients in psychiatric hospitals and prisons, as well as those on the fringes of society. He believed that this work emerged from solitude and from pure and authentic creative impulses, immune to the influences of mainstream culture. In 1972, art historian Roger Cardinal created the term outsider art as an English equivalent to Dubuffet's term and as a more flexible and comprehensive way to describe this growing field of study. Since then, appreciation for this work and artists has grown as the terminology has increasingly become more complex. Additional terms such as self-taught, folk, naive, and visionary have been added and exchanged primarily by arts institutions and individuals in power. Art fairs, galleries, and publications have also become dedicated to this field, yet the terminology remains cast in ways that can often marginalize and exclude. And so that's what we're here to unpack today, the nature of the relationship between the academy or institutions like museums, auction houses, and art collectors, and the artists and their work. This exhibition features artists known locally and at the national level, and I'll share a few of those with you. So here we have a piece by Howard Finster, Untitled. There's references from the Bible about heaven in here. Howard Finster was a Baptist minister from Georgia who was inspired by God to spread the gospel through his art. And so to do that, he built an elaborate backyard sculpture garden that he called Paradise Garden, and he opened that to the public. His work made it into the pop culture lexicon in the 1980s. He did album covers for the bands REM and Talking Heads. This piece is a small sculptural piece, hangs flat on the wall, but it's got quite a relief to it. It's by missionary Mary Proctor, titled My Grandma Penny's Story. Mary Proctor lives and works in Florida in the Tallahassee area. Her career as an artist was sparked by a personal tragedy. She lost her beloved grandmother and aunt and uncle in a house fire. And so in her grief, she had a vision while praying where God told her to paint. And so the first pieces that she painted were portraits of those three family members painted on doors, and she placed them out in her front yard, and they were noticed by someone driving by. And this person happened to be a curator and a critic from New York named Trisha Collins, and she took them back to her gallery in New York. That sort of kickstarted Mary's career. Next up, we've got some local artists. This is a collaborative piece by Reb Roberts, Tom Dimstra, and Donna Hunter Westra. Reb Roberts actually served as our guest curator for this exhibition. He is a tireless advocate for marginalized artists in West Michigan, and he often collaborates with other artists. He will say that he really enjoys the freedom that collaboration inspires. This specific piece sparked some controversy in the very early 2000s when it debuted in an exhibition out closer to the lakeshore, which was closed down, I think, before it even opened because of the offensive content. And I'll let you decide what parts of this are offensive. And finally, we've got this piece by a Kalamazoo-based artist named Donna Collins. This is titled Miss Mushroom. Donna Collins is a self-taught artist out of Kalamazoo, as I mentioned, and she shares openly that she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and she credits art making as an important part of finding balance in her life. So that provides some context for us moving forward, talking about this work in general and the balance of power between institutions and artists. Now I'm going to take us off screen share. I recommend, if you're not already, using the speaker view or gallery view. I've got our speakers pinned, so hopefully you see them up front. You can play around with the different views if you're seeing something different. All right, so I'd like to introduce our panelists. First up, we have Paula Santos. She's the Manager of Learning and Engagement at Intuit, the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art in Chicago, where she relishes teaching diverse and multi-generational audiences. Paula has over a decade of experience in museums, such as the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the National Museum of Mexican Art in Chicago, Brooklyn Botanic Garden, Brooklyn Museum, and the Whitney Museum. She's a graduate of the Leadership in Museum Education Master's Program at Bank Street College and earned her bachelor's degree in art history from Williams College. In addition to her career in museums, she is the host of Cultura Conscious, a podcast on why and how museums and culture workers work with community. And that's actually part of how I found Paula, stumbled across her podcast and absolutely loved it. Next up, we have Kevin Buist, who is an independent, hang on, sorry, I gotta change my view, apologies. Kevin Buist is an independent curator, writer, and former artistic director of ArtPrize, where he oversaw artists, operations, and design. Kevin holds an MA in Visual and Critical Studies from Kendall College of Art and Design. His writing has been featured in numerous print and online publications, including Art Forum, the Art 21 blog, where he was a blogger in residence, mnartists.org, Michigan Quarterly Review, and kevinbuist.com/blog, which is highly entertaining, and I recommend checking it out. He's presented academic papers at the Institute for the Study of Latin American Art at NYU and the College Art Association Annual Conference. He has delivered lectures at many conferences and events, including the International Council of Fine Arts Deans Annual Conference, Museum Next, and the University and College Designers Association Conference, and more. Man, if we don't get a sense of how many academy institutions are out there based on your bios, then I don't know what would illustrate that. So thank you both, Paula and Kevin, for being here. I'm going to direct this first question to Paula to kick things off. Can you expand upon the brief history that I provided of outsider art and kind of talk a little bit about outsider art today?
Yeah, thank you, Amanda, for hosting me and Kevin today to talk about this. You know, you talked about where these ideas came from, right? From Jean Dubuffet and then Roger Cardinal coining the term outsider art. Part of the history that we talk a lot about, even to this day, add into it and in Chicago, is just how the genre really was accepted and embraced here in Chicago through other artists that collected works by, artists that were outside of the academy, who weren't going to art school, right? They weren't like the SAIC or School of the Art Institute crowd. They were artists that were taking in the city of Chicago, such as Wesley Willis or Lee Godey. So when we talk about outsider art, add into it, we are talking about art that's created by artists who faced marginalization, overcame personal odds to make their artwork, who didn't or sometimes could not follow a traditional path of art making, and they had, whatever materials they had at hand to realize their artistic vision. And this is a much broader definition of outsider art than what, art brut, which was very like psychiatric and children and, sometimes called naive art, and art by people that somehow were not tainted in some way, or at least that's the connotation I always get from reading about, art brut. So I will say that, at our institution, just even this week, we talked a lot about how we move forward with discussing outsider art with people who are curious, as they walk into our space, and try to wrap their mind around, well, where does this fit? Like how do I categorize this based on some of the other work that I've seen, maybe at other museums. So yeah, that's what I will say, and I'll let Kevin chime in.
I think it's really interesting, Paula, that you add into it that you're thinking about the artist biography, and you're thinking about like what are the conditions that these artists are creating within, and how that kind of artist biography plays into whether they belong at your institution or whether they'd be better served somewhere else. And the reason I think that that's so interesting is because I think that a big shift that's happened from the middle of the 20th century with Dubuffet and art brut and the sort of early outsider artists and kind of them finding a market and finding institutional support in the United States. The thing that's really shifted, I think, since that time is whether or not that definition can be defined visually. And this is something I was thinking about as I looked at the exhibition, which I saw yesterday, and I loved it. And there's a lot going on there. It's a crowded and busy exhibition in the best way. And I was thinking about the sort of parallels and connections from one artist to the next. You can see these if you look at Amanda's little picture on the screen here. Behind her is a salon style wall. A lot of these artists use text. A lot of these artists use like a kind of a sort of a gestural and straightforward style of rendering figures. There's lots about religion. There's lots about death. There's lots, it's this kind of like loud colors. It's really in your face in a lot of ways. So there's a lot of like visual resonance. But I personally, and I'm, push back on me if you disagree, Paula or Amanda, but I tend to think that you can no longer distinguish this kind of artist purely visually. And the thing I kept thinking about as I was looking at the show yesterday is Jean-Michel Basquiat, who has a visual language that I think is quite similar to a lot of the things on display, coming out of graffiti culture in the 1980s, which is not in the institution, not at least at the time, it wasn't institutionally accepted. And, this kind of visual vocabulary, he's sort of borrowing things from signage and, sort of Text is part of his work, like all the time. Amanda, if I put a link in the chat, will people be able to see that? Can I do that? I'm not going to try to like share an image, but you all, you can just click on this if you want. So this is an art news article about Jean-Michel Basquiat's, who is dead now. If you didn't know, he died in the 1980s. But this is about his relatively recent auction record, which is 110 million for a single painting, which is not the most expensive painting in the history of the world, but it's like up there, right? So I just point that out because this is somebody who at this point, and even before he died, was very accepted by extremely powerful institutions. But to my mind, the sort of visual vocabulary that happens in the artists that we often think of as outsider or intuitive artists is quite similar to somebody like Basquiat. Not the same, obviously. But I just think that that's sort of interesting, and I'm just going to leave it there. I have some other thoughts about that, but I'll just sort of leave that there at this point. Paula, when we talked before, we did not talk about Basquiat. I just thought about that yesterday. So I'm curious, am I wrong? Is there like a visual rhyme happening between him and the stuff that's in this show?
Well, that's, I mean, I've looked at Basquiat's work many times, and I actually have never placed it in, quote unquote, the outsider category in my mind, because of what you mentioned. He was very much in a cultural niche, whatever that was, right? Like whether it was graffiti or other artists. I mean, he collaborated with Andy Warhol, which isn't to say that, certain outside artists didn't do that. Like Howard Finster did that REM cover. And I think it was Mr. Imagination who also did some, commercial work. So it's not out of the question. So I think that's where biography does come in a little bit, where it's like, and this makes me think actually, Kevin, of a phrase that I've heard many times that into it about, or not even just that into it, but just kind of being in the sort of genre, is that outsider art when you see it. So if you're saying that maybe aesthetically we can't do that anymore, then we're having a little bit maybe of a crisis is maybe too strong of a word, but maybe we're having this reckoning moment, right? Of like, can we see it? Can we actually see it? Know it when we see it?
That's a good point. And I think what you're both starting to speak to, Kevin, you outright said this, that sort of the aesthetic, defining the aesthetic of the work is tricky. It's different from one artist to the next. And there is very much a blurring of boundaries between artists who come from that self-taught category and those who are trained. So I'm going to jump to the next question, which I think will help us expand upon these thoughts a little bit, and that is, what sort of connotations come with these terms like outsider and self-taught, raw, intuitive, etc.? What's the underlying message that we're actually talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a thing that has really evolved and changed. Like I spoke about previously a little bit. I think that this is a category that's been it's not static since it's been defined. It's been evolving quite a bit, and I think that at the outset there was some problematic notions to that, like that maybe this idea that these artworks are sort of brilliant in a way that their creators can't possibly understand. And so that there's some kind of like that's the whole thing with the Dubuffet, like, people in psychiatric wards, or, the art of children and the insane or something. And to my ears now, that seems really demeaning and kind of problematic to define it that way. And the other thing, with Dubuffet's original idea of this being sort of untainted, by the outside world or something, I really reject that idea. I think what's happening with the artists he was looking at then, and now, is that there's so many facets of visual culture that some artists are drawing on different streams of imagery, and that might be, you know, signage or graffiti or popular culture or you know, whatever else, you know, like even in the exhibition, you know, Reb talks about growing up in New Orleans and seeing all these beautiful hand painted signs, and you know, like so to think that anybody could create anything that's just sort of like coming from their mind or out of thin air with no influence, I think is just untrue. It's just a matter of like what kind of streams of visual imagery are you letting sort of into your attention to influence your practice. And so in that sense, these artists might have different visual influences, but they're not fundamentally different from other artists.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about this, but here's what I'll share is that I primarily work with, at Intuit, my role is working with all types of audiences, you know, whether it's just the public who's just coming in or young people and teachers. And that's really where I explore a lot of this, like, what are the connotations about outside art? How are people who are learning with us processing, you know, me saying self-taught or outsider art? And some of the things that come about from those conversations is obvious questions of who gets to say they're outsiders. Like, is it the artists that say they're outsiders? So I get, especially with young people, with teenagers, you know, they're constantly questioning, well, like, who calls them outsiders, or what does it mean to be called like someone who is doing like intuitive art? Like, you know, when you make art, there's all this effort and all this conscious mark making, right? Even if, you know, there might be, the artist may, like Finster, right, thinking about like having some sort of calling to make art, but it is like very, you're making something, right? And I love talking about those things because there is a lot of room to talk about the complexity of who gets to say this is outsider art. And especially if we're talking about, you know, what is outsider art going to be in the future, right? Like, and even at our institution thinking about like, okay, well, you know, there are certain outsider artists that are, you know, if there was an outsider canon, these are the artists. Like, does that mean we're only going to show those artists? Or does it mean that we start developing relationships with other types of artists that do fit within, you know, what our criteria would be, which is, you know, self-taught, overcame personal odds, things like that. So I always feel, and this is not only me, our chief curator, Allison, you know, I just had her talk to our teens, and they asked her this question point blank too, like, well, who gets to say who's an outsider artist? And she will always, you know, welcome the question and answer with more questions, you know, like that it's not, we are not defining it like Dubuffet or Roger Cardinal anymore. It has evolved, but we're in that evolution.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you bring up. I would love to see a group of students walking through Intuit and to see, or even this exhibition, and to see what their reaction is, especially teenagers. I hadn't thought about that, just the idea of being an outsider, which brings me to our next question.
Just really quickly on that, just the notion that there's a canon of outside artists is really fascinating. That's it's a bit of an oxymoron, right? Like, because if you're inside the, I mean, it naturally has to evolve that way, right? Like, we have to have sort of, you can't write about everyone, and you have to have exemplars that you kind of, you know, build the discourse around. But it's just kind of funny.
Yeah, and let me say that I just made up that the canon, but there, at least in my time of working at Intuit and, you know, reading about other exhibitions and other things that other museums are doing, there are definitely those like outsider artists that people know that are now showing at the Art Institute of Chicago, they're showing at Smithsonian. So there are like these really well-known artists that are defined or put in this category.
Yeah, I mean, there's only so much space, you know, in a catalog, in a physical gallery, in an hour that you have to talk about something. So you have to choose, which again, I think is totally related to this next question. And for our audience who may not be familiar with some of these insider institutions, there's Intuit in Chicago. There's the Outsider Art Fair in New York. It's an annual fair, I think. There's the Kentucky Festival, which happens down in the South, and it's just outsider artists who set up booths and sell their own work from artist to art collector. There's the Slotin Folk Art Auction. They publish a catalog. You know, art collectors can purchase directly through them, so not from the artist directly, but through an auction house. So now that we have all of these institutions, and again, this is kind of the same question, but just starting with a different premise, how do all of these institutions who are dedicated to promoting, preserving, naming outsider art, how does that change the idea of this work being outsider if they have their own sort of insider institutions?
Inside the outside. Yeah, I mean, I think it's yeah, I think it's a natural consequence of both the market and scholarship, which sometimes overlap and relate a little bit, but you know, are sort of two prongs of the art world that kind of run in parallel to one another and sometimes interact. But you know, like that is of course kind of, you know, going to kind of organize and clump together things like that. And anytime you have something like that, then you know there's something that you can be invited to or not, or be included in or not included in. But I think at that point it's more like, it's not so much a question of whether something has an inside and an outside, which is like a really philosophical question. It's more a sort of what's the lineage of like this certain group of artists and the institutions that have sprung up to support that conversation or that market.
I guess the way I think about it is, and this is fraught too, but I think about it in terms of, you know, there are a lot of culturally specific institutions out there that will show work by, you know, I used to work at the National Museum of Mexican Art, so we showed Mexican artwork. And, you know, while that may seem clear cut, it really isn't, you know, like, does it mean from Mexico? Does it mean Mexican American? What if you are 3 generations removed? Anyway, but in any case, the point of it is that it's important for us at Intuit to have a space where artists who didn't come up through a traditional school system or gallery system, or maybe even had a community of artists, you know, that they had relationships with and could, you know, have conversations about art about, that they have a space where their artwork is seen as what it is, like amazing artwork. And we were just having a conversation about, yes, a story is important, right? Like stories are what help us connect with audiences, and people connect to the stories of artists like Martin Ramirez. They connect to the stories of Clementine Hunter, you know, these, you know, outsider artists. But what really makes this artwork what it is that visual impact, like that excellence visually, you know, and that's something that our curator also keeps reminding us of. So I think of it more in this way of like, there should be spaces where this artwork is given that wall space, you know, and look behind you, like all these artists, you know, want to give them more and more space, because they may not necessarily fit into what the MCA is doing here in Chicago. They may not fit into what the Art Institute is doing. So where does that work get seen? Where does that work get pondered? You know, I think one of the things that, especially over the time that we've been closed, something that has been so wonderful for me is to be able to connect with people online and share the stories and the work, like quite literally the work of art, with audiences, and give it that attention and give it that focus that a Seurat painting gets. Give it the attention that like Monet water lily painting gets, even if this work of art was made from pen and cardboard, or you know, just pieces of plywood. So I think that's where I see the power of spaces that focus on the genre. And like I said, I do think about it kind of like in the space of, that's why we also have culturally specific museums, you know, for very similar reasons.
Yeah, any follow-up thoughts, Kevin?
Yeah, I think that the culturally specific museum point is a really good one. And, you know, just thinking more about how there are many art worlds running in parallel. And I think that when you divide them into kind of subsets, it's always going to be a little arbitrary, or like the edges of those definitions are going to be a little bit fuzzy. But I think it's still worth doing, because it's a really useful practice to hang a bunch of artists together and say something is happening, something's happening here with all these artists. They all seem to be like having a conversation with one another. And you know, the classifications like this, like outsider or intuitive art, they're not watertight. Like they, you know, like they. You can poke holes in those definitions, but the definitions are still really useful. You know, same thing like with a, you know, National Museum of Mexican Art. You know, it's sort of like, well, define Mexican, and then you get, you know, like into the weeds of like expatriates versus colonial versus indigenous versus, you know, and you. But again, it's like, it's the point that it can't be done perfectly isn't the point. It's still like this way of moving forward a conversation among artists that have like these sort of parallel practices in one way or another, and that's really useful.
Yeah, you're reminding me that, you know, as humans learn from a very young age, we start to place things into categories, and that's just sort of the natural way that we understand the world. And I think there's a lot of that very basic idea in some of what we're talking about here. Paula, I really appreciated what you were talking about when you were mentioning how these institutions who have power are sort of giving work like this the space and the platform that it deserves. And so I think I'm going to skip over, if the two of you happen to be looking at the list of questions I sent, I'm going to skip over the next one and dive into the fact that a lot of the artists represented here and at Intuit and other institutions come from marginalized communities. So let's talk a little bit about how privilege in race, class, and gender, and ability versus disability play a role in who's considered insider or outsider, and also how that sort of changes the duty that these institutions have in elevating this kind of work.
Yeah, I was most excited to talk about this question because it's one that I think about a lot. So one of the things that struck me so much when I began to be just more immersed in the genre was just the sheer amount of Black artists that we have, the artists who were disabled, artists who faced, you know, a million racism, a really big one. And like many people in this genre, I was very drawn to those stories and those narratives. Now, here is where I do think that we could do a lot better. And by we, I mean, you know, people who are talking about this work of art, is that a lot of how I have seen people talk about this work or even write about this work is very much under this white savior lens that, you know, oh, Bill Trailer was sleeping in a store and all these nice people would give him supplies, and you know, despite growing up and being you know, enslaved, he became this great artist. Like despite everything, he became a great artist. And whenever you know, I talk about with audiences and even talk internally with our staff, I really always just want to shift that type of thinking, and you know, and I think people at Intuit are very, very, you know, aligned with this as well. Is just like, you know, an artist facing all of these adversities, you know, there's a larger context here. There's a larger historical context for this. There's a lot of structural problems that have to do with whether they grew up Black in the South, whether they're migrant workers, for example. So like all of those set of conditions are really important to even talk about that story, because or else it's just this like feel good story about how someone who was literally institutionalized for 3 decades was an amazing artist despite everything. And that is so problematic to me. That really takes away all of the responsibility of perhaps we should, as a society, care a lot more about mental health issues. Perhaps as a society, we should actually take on the issues of racism. Like, why are people houseless? You know, so like all of these issues that I think really play out, you know, in the kind of the background of this genre, to me is just like so important. And I say this as someone who, you know, has worked in very mainstream museums where, you know, as anyone has been, you know, out there thinking about or reading museum news, you know, museums are like wringing their hands about like, how do we become relevant? How do we talk about our artists, about social justice? And I'm like, it's here. It's like literally here, you know, in this work. And, you know, Deb, who is our president, she's on this call right now. You know, she feels that way too. It's just like a shift, you know, that in talking about that work, that hopefully, you know, I'm making some changes or inroads, at least in our world.
I think one thing I'll add is that when we look at you know, the sort of the insider outsider narrative, and you kind of look at how that has changed over time in institutions from, you know, the 20th century to now. I think there's progress has been made on, you know, for example, showing more diverse artists. And there are certainly, you know, Black and Latino artists now who are very much in the canon, right? Very much in the institution. But that's one way to look at the progress being made in that way. But I think also another way to look at it is who is the gatekeeper and who gets to make the decision. And so, you know, you can see a Carrie James Marshall exhibition at MCA Chicago or wherever, and it's amazing, and he's like an absolute just powerhouse of an artist, and that's great, and like we're better for it to have an artist like that among us. But there's still this other question of like who gets to sort of be the kingmaker, right? And so there's a difference in sort of who's in the executive suite that decides that Carrie James Marshall gets a show, and that's great, they made the right decision, but who's there is like another kind of level of it, which I think is always worth thinking about as well.
I wanted to add, Kevin, you reminded me of something that we had discussed kind of in the lead up to this, is that sort of like, I keep saying that there are these sort of more white savior narratives about the work. There's even thinking about gatekeeping. It's like, well, where do they come from? Like, where do those stories come from? Who do they benefit? And, it's like kicking a hornet's nest, but, a lot of it does come from collectors, right? And this isn't exclusive to the genre of outsider art. It's also in contemporary art world, right? Like what are collectors selling? How do they sell the work? What does like Black art mean, or like Latinx art mean? Because it's about this branding and making it enticing, right, for someone to buy it. So that's something that we are very cognizant of, is like who is talking about the genre, how they're talking about it, and just being a little bit more, or a lot more rather, critical of where those perspectives may be coming from.
Yeah, good points from both of you. Thank you for that. I think, Paula, you mentioned collectors and who's selling what and why, and what are the stories that we tell connected to artists, and what's the motivation to tell those stories? Is it because the artist wants their personal narrative to be part of the viewing experience of seeing their work, or are we just kind of obsessed as a culture with the idea of an artist coming from nothing and making really incredible work that we're not used to or not familiar with? And I think to a certain degree, outsider work, and we already talked about how it's really tough to define the aesthetic, the style of outsider work. So I realize that this question is problematic from the beginning, but I think that a lot of outsider work really connects with audiences because either it has that sort of childlike quality, or it comes with this story, this like either heroic or tragic or just different than what we're used to story about the artists themselves. So I'm wondering what both of your thoughts are on that idea about how just the look and the stories of the work and these artists are connecting with audiences.
I think that it's, you talked earlier about Jean Dubuffet and Art Brut, and sort of the rise of this discourse around outsider and intuitive artists, and kind of coming about in the mid and later 20th century. And I think it's worth looking at what else was happening in the art world in that time, sort of in the academy that the outsider artists were outside of, because I think that there's a lot of parallels there. And I think that a lot of what was happening in the formal art world was the avant-garde was kind of opening up modes of making and modes of artistic practice that were far more expansive, right? Like what you could call a work of art and what kind of actions you could declare were sort of put on a pedestal for the contemplation as a work of art, that like those definitions started to be broken open really widely. And I think what's really wonderful about that, and so kind of egalitarian or democratic about it, is once the academic artists are sort of free to use any materials or techniques or approaches to making art, that also frees, like the opening up goes both ways. So that also opens up people who come from other backgrounds to then participate as well. There's this really great, I'm going to paraphrase it because I can't quote it exactly, but this really great idea from this essay by this theorist named Boris Groys, and he talks about the thing that happens constantly where people look at a painting and they're like, oh, my kid could do that. And he challenges people to think like, okay, if you hear someone say that, it's not an insult to the artist, it's actually a compliment to the child, right? Like, and what that means is that the methods of making art have been so fully opened and so fully democratized that even children can participate on an even playing field. And I love thinking about it that way. And I think that applies to this, to the outsider art conversation as well, where it's not like a, sort of this like, oh, look at this unintentionally brilliant thing that we rescued from this artist who doesn't know what they're doing. Like that's like the condescending point of view. I think like the better point of view is to say there's so many modes of making. There's so many ways to make images. There's so many ways to make objects that we can kind of like make space for all of them, and accept artists in kind of in their full humanity, even if they're coming from very different, visual traditions.
Kevin, I love that. I love the way that you put that, because so we do a lot of work with educators in getting them up to speed with the genre, doing research on specific artists that they're interested in, and then sharing that with their classrooms. And time again, teachers talk about how their students can really relate to the work, and there's like an intimacy with the work that they don't necessarily see with other artists that they're showing. And part of it is a story, right? There are really compelling stories in the genre, but a lot of it has to do with materials, being able to say like, these sculptures were made out of discarded pieces of metal. Like this was made out of construction material that was just kind of left behind and then made into something that is beautiful and compelling and like a full-blown work of art. So then there's a lot of connections there with, well, what is our potential as makers? Like there's so much potential in the making if we start looking around and start seeing like, we can do this, we can make this, we have our own vision or ideas of what our artwork will be. I think the other thing I will say is, and I think I was recently talking to our chief curator about this too, where she mentioned that, when she first really got into this genre, she was very rattled by the work. And I hadn't put it in those words before, but I do remember walking into the collection that the Milwaukee Art Museum has, which is, it has, I think they call it vernacular work there. And it was so different from everything else, right? It had, the figures looked different, the mark making was different, the subject matter was really different too. And I truly was rattled. And I think that that's something that is so, I can't define that for people, and people might not even tell me that, right, when they walk into the space. But I do think that there is something powerful that happens when you encounter artists that are, following their own vision, I guess is one way to put it, and to be encountered with that imagery that it's so of that artist. I think that that's one way. So since I'm an educator, and that's kind of how I think about things, in John Dewey talks about art as experience, where you have this experience where you are with the work and you feel the sense of joy and fulfillment with the work. And sometimes when I hear people, around the genre say things like, oh, outsider art, when you see it, I think what they're talking about is that an experience, in that John Dewey sense, like the experience of that joy and fulfillment in recognizing the materials, recognizing that vision. And Kevin, you thought you were getting philosophical. This truly is art philosophy, but I do think that there is that kind of internal fulfillment and enjoyment that students and visitors have walking into a space.
Yeah, that's a lovely thought. Kevin, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think that part of that art is experience. Kind of a thing is that you can get from a lot of this work is just the sort of a pleasure from the richness of it, and a pleasure from the way that a lot of these artists seem to build really intricate visual vocabularies. And it's often not. I think it is not. I'm doing double negatives. It's not as referential as other artworks, right? Like it's not sort of like, oh, this is a nod to Donald Judd, and I know that, wink, wink. It doesn't, work that way, the way that some contemporary art does. I don't think it doesn't reference anything. Like I said earlier, I think that these artists are taking in visual culture from maybe just different sources, unusual sources, but you don't need to. I think with this kind of work, part of that experience is that you don't need to have this sort of deep catalog of reference. You can kind of enjoy the surface richness of it, which is just as valuable.
Yeah, so I'd like to leave some time for questions from our audience if there are any. Is there anything else, Kevin or Paula, that you'd like to share before we move into that?
I have it up here, so I'm going to drop the link to that essay that I referenced about how the avant-garde is the most democratic art of all. So all students on this feed, this is your homework assignment, is to read this. That's it. I'm just going to say that because I can. So you have to read it now.
You have the platform. All right. Do we have any questions from our audience? I'm going to pull up the chat. Feel free to either type it into the chat or raise your hand and we'll take you off mute if you can't unmute yourselves. Give that a few minutes. While we're waiting for questions, I want to quickly plug the other two events in this series, Unpacking the Exhibition Conversation series. We've touched on some of the other two topics here. The other two are art and healing and art and materials, specifically unconventional materials. So the art and healing conversation will be on Friday, October 22nd, also at noon. And then the third one will be the final week of the exhibition, beginning of November. It'll be November 5th on a Wednesday. We've got an artist who's represented here in the exhibition, Tom Dimstra, and also a GVSU professor of metals and jewelry, who Renee Zettel-Sterling, and she will actually be having an exhibition with us in the winter. I think my screen might have froze for a second, so I hope you all caught that. The events that I just mentioned are all on the webpage up at the top of the chat, so I hope that at least some of you will catch those as well. We've got a question. What defines outsider art on its own style? Well, yeah, we've been talking around that kind of the whole time. Kevin or Paula, do you have a 1 or 2 sentence way to drill down to that question?
I could take a stab. At it. I might be wrong about this because it's not like I'm not a scholar of the field or something. But my sense is that when work by these artists was sort of first brought into formal gallery spaces, these artists were truly outsiders in many senses of the term, right? Not sold in traditional galleries, not educated in traditional academies, and sort of not a part of the discourse surrounding art. And so that distinction was meaningful, both in terms of who they were and then also how the work looked. Now that distinction is a little less clear, but it's still a useful category as like to sort of define a tradition or a lineage of image making that has been going on for several decades. I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think I would add that at least in a lot of the if we can call it quote unquote more traditional outsider artists that, as I was talking, there are a couple dozen artists that are seen as like outsider artists. I think one thing that there's a through line of they did not necessarily pursue the being an artist in a way that someone else would have pursued that. Like, even if they came in contact with gallerists, it was through circumstances, it was through people who knew about their work. There wasn't that trajectory of like, you go to art school and then you start selling your works of art. And that part of it is still very much in conversations of a genre of like, traditionally trained is like a big, that if you're traditionally trained, you are not, an outsider artist. And that's kind of like a clear cutoff. And one more thing I'll add to that is that there are artists, and one who we just had a show of at Intuit, his name is George Widener, who did consider himself an outsider artist earlier in his career, but now no longer considers himself that. Like he just is not working sort of in that style. And also, he has had a lot of success with his work, so he's like, I'm not an outsider artist anymore, and very clearly has said that.
That's super interesting that an artist can sort of like self-identify based on their level of success if they no longer feel like that label outsider applies to them. We've got two more questions. One more question came in twice. So it's kind of a long question the way it's typed out. I'm going to ask it really simply, and Sienna, if I don't get it right, please let me know. In simple terms, how do you think outsider art connects to philosophy as a field of study? We think back through some of the concepts that we've been unpacking about, who gets to decide, what kind of power does this work have existing outside of an academic structure?
So I'm not sure if this is exactly an answer to this question, but it's something else that I wanted to say. And I think it relates to this. How can outsider art be connected to philosophy? I think that one thing that happened, like we said earlier, I said earlier, I don't think that this kind of work is very easy or maybe even possible to distinguish purely visually anymore. It may have been in like the 1950s, but and so you think about artist biography, but you also think about to what extent are artists both making the work and sort of propping up the theory that supports the making of the work. And I think this is the thing that happens in the academy. And it's funny that we talk about art outside the academy, because this is Grand Valley. Like this, as far as West Michigan is concerned, this is the academy. But that's great, because that's where these conversations have the freedom to take place. But what happens in art school is you're taught to make work, and then you're taught to like sort of build this body of theory, or sort of draw from a body of theory. And this is where philosophy comes in order to kind of prop up and give reason to the practice of what you're creating, right? This sort of like this crafting of artist statements is this sort of like, you're creating a philosophical argument for the existence of the objects and images that you're making. Artists do is that they a whole whatever, there's always going to be an exception, but a lot of these artists are not so much concerned with building up a body of theory that supports their practice. They're doing it because, well, we talked about motivations before, like maybe they came to them in a dream, or they might have motivations that seem almost exotic compared to the average art student. And I really like that. And I think that even a lot of the artists that are a part of the academy, accepted by the academy, people that are sort of in the canon of art history, actually operated more that way than you might think. And I think that the standard way of doing art school, where like you both make work and you collect and write a body of theory that supports and justifies your work. The longer I was a part of that, the more it's bothered me. And so my advice to artists is maybe make things and don't justify them. Don't come up with a perfect theoretical reason or philosophical justification for what you make. Like something that I think you can learn from the artists in this exhibition is sometimes you can make things just to make things and like let other people puzzle over why you did it. That's what critics are for.
And the public, they can decide what they think, right? Paula, any other thoughts on that?
You know, not really. I think Kevin approached it in a certain way. Maybe my only addition is that, I mean, there are so many different, like every, you know, outsider, self-taught artist is its own individual case. But sometimes I think about like, at what point do they consider themselves artists? So even just this idea of artist, you know, is one that compels me sometimes, you know, as I'm looking at drawings or like James Castle, you know, and making all those drawings, you know, like what if you are doing this work considering yourself an artist, or what if you're doing for example, sculptures, but you're a barber, you know, like at what kind of power is there in saying you're an artist, I guess is my philosophical question.
Yeah, that's a good one. I could do a whole nother conversation series, art and artists, just the label. Who gets to be one? What does it mean? How do we think about artists? I could go on and on. All right, well, we're just after 1 o'clock and I know a lot of students need to get to class and there's probably a lot of people on their lunch break. So I wanna say thank you to both Kevin and Paul. I'm really grateful for you taking the time. I wanna remind our audience that our reception is coming up next Thursday from 5 to 8 p.m. You can RSVP on our website. And thank you so much for being here. And with that, I will say goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Stop recording.